In today's episode, a group of 4 campers are attacked by a massive grizzly bear infected with rabies. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying bear attack on Yevgeny Starkov. Welcome to Final Affliction. Some might argue that there's never a good time to visit Siberia. For the majority of the year, the extreme snow, storms, and generally inhospitable conditions make for a pretty rough place to take a leisurely hike in. But July through August falls into Russia's summer months. Not that that means that it won't be cold. On a good summer day, the highest temperatures that you can expect only reaches about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Mornings are frosty, and nights are cold enough to require a few extra layers beneath your blankets. And the wildlife there is just as unforgiving as the weather. Wolves, brown bears, and snow leopards make up the larger predators. But don't forget about the giant moose and the smaller lynxes that are just as likely to kill a man if they happen to be cornered. Today's events take place in the southern end of Russia, in the Cyan Mountains in Yevgeny National Park, right in the heart of the Siberian region. It's a popular hiking destination, but it's not one for the novice hiker. Just like the rest of Siberia, it's rugged, cold, and filled with more dangers than most people can handle. The group of 4 hikers traveled all the way from Moscow to make a 2-week trip out there in the wilderness. But these were no city slickers who were biting off more than they could chew. Yevgeny Starkov, Anton Shelkunov, Pavel Zemchukov, and another unnamed man all grew up in the countryside. They were seasoned hikers, hunters, and they knew how to rough it out in the wild. Each of them made their way to the city because of their jobs and met each other at a hikers club. The 4 became best friends, since most of the members of the club were either on the older side or merely young people interested in getting outside the city for the first time. Yevgeny was the oldest of all, at 42, and the rest were all in their mid to late 30s. The 4 had a map hung up in Yevgeny's apartment, dotted with pins at all the mountains and spots that they wanted to scale and explore. For the past 2 years, the men made it their project to visit every one of the locations that they'd pinned on that map of Russia. They wanted to climb the Cyan Mountains eventually, but for this first visit, they thought it was wiser to trek out the park from one end to the other to get the lay of the land and an idea of what the climate was like. Next year, this time around, they would attempt to scale the mountains. The first week went just as planned. They fit everything they needed into their packs and set off, camping at a different spot every night. On the 8th day, the men settled next to a hilltop that had a river running beside it for 2 days, veering away from their usual routine so that they could do some fishing and rest their legs after spending 8 days on their feet trekking over the rocky and rugged terrain. The men were doing everything they should have to deter animals from being lured to the smell of their food. But after the first evening, an animal already found the place where they'd buried their food scraps. Another had dug into the covered hole that served as their toilet, too. The entire wilderness seemed to be aware of them already, and they'd been there less than 24 hours. But since the scratches on the ground where the animal had dug looked like it was made by a small animal, and they'd only spotted 2 moose stopping for a drink of water, they weren't all that worried about anything more dangerous. But that was a big mistake. The smell of their fish cooking over the coals alerted a brown bear in the area. Even in the middle of summer, when there's more food than usual, every single animal in the Russian wilderness will never let an opportunity for food pass up, especially not one that was sick. Something was very wrong with this adult male brown bear. Its eyes were bloodshot, probably from a raging fever. It was foaming at the mouth, and it was unusually aggressive. Whether it was rabid or had a parasitic infection that entered the brain, as bears are known to be susceptible to, no one knows. On the second evening, the bear began to lumber through the trees, following the smell of cooked fish. All night it walked until it finally reached the camp just as day broke. The group had just finished breakfast and were about to get packed up. Anton and Pavel were rolling up the sleeping bags to put them back in their packs, while Yevgeny and the other man went to disassemble the first of the two tents. Just then, the massive hairy beast burst through the trees. Everyone stopped what they were doing, utterly bemused and caught off guard that they were suspended in a moment of dumbfounded shock. The bear took one look at the four humans and let out a deafening roar of fury, the foamed spit around its mouth flying out at the force of its breath, and then it charged straight at Yevgeny, who was closest to the tree line. Everyone scattered, all gunning for the rocky outcrop. Everyone knew that their only chance to make it out alive was to get to higher ground. They carried no weapons besides their utility knives, and that wouldn't do any good against this enormous specimen of bear. The bear gave an angry swipe at Yevgeny, knocking him off his feet and breaking his jaw instantly. The crack of his jaw snapping sounded through the forest like a gunshot. The bear left Yevgeny to chase the men that were running toward the hill. But with all of them heading in a different direction, it was confused about which one to focus on. It hesitated for a second, then turned back to Yevgeny, who was knocked out cold on the ground. It took Anton and the others only 3 minutes to make it to the top of the hill, and only then did they realize that Yevgeny wasn't with them. They peeked over the edge of the sharp rock down to the camp, and even from up there they could see the horror playing out underneath them, clear as day. The animal was tearing chunks of flesh out of their friend's abdomen. Even through all the blood, the flecks of white saliva were still sharply visible around the bear's mouth. For what seemed like forever, they could only stare and listen in absolute disgust and horror at the sounds of their friend being consumed right before their eyes. Pavel got to his senses first. Whispering words of comfort and sense, he kept the other two from going into a full panic. Even if Yevgeny was alive after that first swipe, he was certainly dead now. There was no question about that. The only mercy he'd been spared was that he was unconscious when he died. The only chance they had to make it out against a possibly rabid bear was to escape while it was preoccupied with eating their friend. The hike to their scheduled stop was 9 hours of hiking away. They could make it before the day was out. Staying put wasn't an option. The weather was too unpredictable to wait a few days for help to arrive. Staff at the rest point were unlikely to call in for help for at least 48 hours after they missed their check-in. All of their supplies were down at the camp. They had no water, no food, and they weren't even wearing shoes. And if they were caught at night wearing only their light underclothing, they'd be dead from exposure for sure. There was just no other way. They took one last look over the outcrop. The bear had made himself comfortable, sitting on its rump, gnawing at Yevgeny's left leg, almost like it was taking its time to savor its meal. They began to walk, the sounds of bones cracking, flesh squelching, and the satisfied growls of a feasting bear fading away in the background. What should have been a 9 or 10 hour hike was completed in just 7 hours. They'd walked right through their socks, and their feet were bleeding by the time they got to the cabin. There, the older couple who manned the station were appalled at the state of them, and even more horrified when they heard what had happened. But the chances of retrieving Yevgeny was virtually zero. Not only had the bear had 7 hours to do what he wanted with the body, the weather was starting to turn bad. In typical Siberian fashion, an unexpected storm rolled in just as the trio were airlifted out of the area. The chopper just couldn't risk flying back into the rain and mountain winds that were drenching the area. When they did finally get to the camp, the bear was long gone, and it had taken Yevgeny with it. The rain had washed away all signs of a spoor to follow, but still they tried for 5 days before finally admitting defeat when the next storm came rolling in. Yevgeny was gone, and all that was left behind was a ruined tent and a map of Russia filled with plans that were never fulfilled.